In September 2025, an AI system analyzing ancient Viking DNA discovered something that contradicts everything we thought we knew about human migration, genetic diversity, and the origins of European civilization. The findings were so unexpected that the research team initially assumed the AI had malfunctioned. It hadn't. The data was correct, and what it revealed about Viking genetics is rewriting human history in ways that make archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. The AI found genetic markers in Viking remains that shouldn't exist. DNA sequences that don't match any known European population. Gene variants that appear in modern humans but were supposed to have died out 40,000 years ago. And most disturbingly, evidence that Vikings were genetically far more diverse than any population that came before or after them. Here's what the AI discovered, and why scientists are scrambling to explain it. The breakthrough came from a machine learning system developed at the University of Cambridge, specifically designed to analyze ancient DNA. Traditional genetic analysis looks for known patterns and sequences. This AI was trained to identify anomalies, statistical outliers, and patterns that human researchers wouldn't recognize because they don't fit existing models. Here's what makes this different. When human geneticists analyze ancient DNA, they're looking for confirmation of what they already suspect. They have hypotheses about migration patterns, population mixing, and genetic inheritance. They analyze data to prove or disprove those hypotheses. The AI had no hypotheses. It just looked at the data and identified patterns without any preconceptions about what should or shouldn't be there. The AI analyzed DNA from 442 Viking-era remains across Scandinavia, Britain and Iceland, spanning 750 CE to 1050 CE. These weren't newly discovered remains. Most had been analyzed by human geneticists years ago. But the AI found something in the data that humans missed because they weren't looking for it. The first anomaly appeared in Norwegian Viking remains from 850 CE. The AI identified a genetic sequence in mitochondrial DNA that didn't match any known European haplogroup. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from mothers and mutates very slowly, making it perfect for tracking ancient lineages. Every European population has mitochondrial DNA that traces back to one of 9 main haplogroups that arrived in Europe between 45,000 and 10,000 years ago. This sequence didn't match any of them. But here's what made it impossible to ignore. The AI found this same anomalous sequence in 6% of all Viking remains analyzed. That's not an error. That's not contamination. That's not a statistical fluke. 6% of Vikings carried mitochondrial DNA that doesn't fit into the established model of human migration into Europe. Human geneticists have mapped human mitochondrial DNA into a tree, showing how all maternal lineages relate to each other. Every person alive today can trace their mitochondrial DNA back through this tree to mitochondrial Eve, the common ancestor of all modern humans who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. The Viking sequences don't fit on this tree. They branch off in ways that suggest either a completely unknown maternal lineage that somehow survived for thousands of years without being detected in any other population, or the tree itself is wrong. The AI identified the anomaly by comparing mutation rates. Mitochondrial DNA mutates at a known rate, roughly 1 mutation every 3,500 years. By counting mutations, you can estimate how long ago 2 lineages diverged. The Viking anomalous sequences have mutation patterns suggesting they diverged from known European lineages 25,000 to 40,000 years ago. But here's the problem with that timeline. Europe 40,000 years ago was inhabited by Neanderthals and early modern humans who left no surviving lineages in modern populations. Every maternal lineage in Europe today traces to populations that arrived between 10,000 and 45,000 years ago. The Viking sequences suggest a lineage that survived from before the last glacial maximum 26,000 years ago, when Europe was largely uninhabitable. Where did these lineages hide for 30,000 years? How did they survive the Ice Age that wiped out most European populations? And why do they only appear in Viking-era remains and nowhere else? The second major discovery was even more disturbing to established models. The AI analysis showed that Viking-era Scandinavians had greater genetic diversity than any modern European population and greater than any ancient population previously analyzed. High diversity means people within the population are genetically different from each other. Low diversity means they're genetically similar. Diversity decreases when populations go through bottlenecks where only a few individuals survive, or when populations are isolated for long periods. Modern European populations have relatively low genetic diversity compared to African populations because all Europeans descend from small founding populations that migrated into Europe at various times. The expectation was that ancient populations would have even lower diversity because they were smaller and more isolated. Vikings broke this pattern completely. The AI found that Viking populations had genetic diversity levels 40% higher than modern Scandinavians. They had variants from across Europe, the Mediterranean, Central Asia, and genetic markers that don't appear in any known population. Think about what this means. Vikings are supposed to be Scandinavians who occasionally raided and traded with other regions. The genetic data suggests something far more complex, all concentrated in Scandinavia during a 300-year period. But here's what doesn't make sense. After the Viking Age ended around 1050 CE, this diversity disappeared. Modern Scandinavians have normal European genetic diversity. Where did all these variant lineages go? They can't have all died out. Genetic lineages don't vanish in a few generations unless there's catastrophic population collapse. There's no historical evidence for that. The AI is telling us that Viking populations were genetically unique in human history, and then that uniqueness vanished within a century. Human geneticists don't have an explanation for this. The third discovery was the most controversial. The AI identified genetic markers in Viking DNA that match modern populations from regions Vikings never reached or didn't have contact with during that era. Viking remains from Iceland, dated to 920 CE, contain genetic markers common in modern Polynesian populations. Polynesians didn't reach their current island territories until around 1000 CE and had zero contact with Europe until the 1500s. There is no historical mechanism for Polynesian DNA to appear in Iceland in 920 CE, yet it's there. Viking remains from Norway, dated to 880 CE, contain genetic markers, most common in modern Siberian populations east of the Ural Mountains. Vikings are known to have traded with Western Siberian populations, but these markers are from groups that lived 3,000 miles east of any known Viking contact. How did their DNA end up in Norwegian Vikings? Viking remains from Britain, dated to 950 CE, contained genetic markers matching modern North African Amazigh populations. Vikings did raid North Africa, so this is plausible, except these markers are from Amazigh groups in the interior Sahara who had no coastal contact. Vikings would have needed to travel hundreds of miles inland to encounter these populations. There's no historical record of this, but here's the pattern the AI identified. These aren't isolated cases. Across the 442 remains analyzed, 31% contain genetic markers from populations that Vikings had little or no historical contact with. The genetic mixing is far more extensive than historical records suggest. Either Vikings had contact with far more populations across far greater distances than any historical evidence indicates. This percentage is consistent across all modern populations and all ancient remains ever analyzed, until the AI analyzed Viking DNA. Viking remains show Neanderthal DNA percentages ranging from 1% to 9%. That's more than double the maximum that should exist in any human population. Some individual Viking remains have Neanderthal DNA percentages higher than any human ever tested. The AI identified this by analyzing specific genetic segments known to originate from Neanderthals. In modern humans, these segments are degraded and fragmented because they've been diluted over 50,000 years of mixing and mutation. In some Viking remains, these segments are intact and less degraded than they should be. Here's what this implies. Either Vikings had recent Neanderthal ancestry, which is impossible because Neanderthals went extinct 40,000 years ago, or these intact Neanderthal segments were preserved in some human population for 40,000 years without degrading through normal genetic processes. Neither explanation works. Neanderthals are extinct, and DNA segments degrade over time through mutation and recombination. But that's what the AI found in Viking remains. But here's where it gets stranger. The high Neanderthal DNA percentages don't correlate with anything else. Some Vikings with 8% Neanderthal DNA have typical European ancestry otherwise. Some Vikings with normal 2% Neanderthal DNA have the anomalous mitochondrial sequences. There's no pattern. It's like multiple impossible genetic anomalies existed simultaneously in the same population without any unifying explanation. Some geneticists are proposing a radical explanation called the ghost population theory. The idea is that there was a human population in Europe that survived from the pre-Ice Age period through the last glacial maximum by retreating to refugia, isolated areas that remained habitable during the Ice Age. This ghost population would have been genetically isolated for 20,000 years. When the Ice Age ended and modern populations migrated back into Europe, this ghost population would have mixed with incoming populations, contributing genetic variants that survived from much earlier periods. The theory explains the anomalous mitochondrial DNA as remnants of pre-Ice Age maternal lineages preserved in the ghost population. It explains the high Neanderthal DNA as this population having interbred with Neanderthals more extensively before they went extinct. It explains the genetic diversity as Vikings having descended partially from this ghost population and partially from more recent migrants. But here's the problem with this theory. If this ghost population existed, we should find evidence of them everywhere in Europe, not just in Vikings. We should find their genetic signatures in all European populations that descended from post-Ice Age mixing. We don't. The anomalies appear almost exclusively in Viking-era remains and then disappear. The ghost population theory also doesn't explain the Polynesian or distant Siberian genetic markers. A ghost population hiding in European refugia during the Ice Age wouldn't have Polynesian DNA. Another explanation focuses on Viking trade networks. Vikings traveled farther than most people realize. They reached Constantinople, Baghdad, and possibly even North America. Their trade routes stretched from Greenland to Central Asia. Maybe the genetic diversity simply reflects extensive contact with populations across this massive geographic range. This explains some findings, but not others. Yes, Vikings traded with Central Asian populations, so Central Asian genetic markers make sense. Yes, Vikings took slaves from raids, which would introduce foreign DNA into Scandinavian populations. This explains the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern genetic variants. But it doesn't explain the Polynesian DNA in Iceland before Polynesians reached Polynesia. It doesn't explain genetic markers from Saharan populations Vikings never encountered. It doesn't explain the anomalous mitochondrial sequences that don't match any known population. And it especially doesn't explain why all this genetic diversity disappeared after the Viking Age ended. If Vikings were mixing extensively with diverse populations through trade and raids, that mixing should have continued after 1050 CE. Scandinavians didn't become isolated after the Viking Age. They continued trading and interacting with the same regions. Yet the genetic diversity drops dramatically in post-Viking Scandinavian populations. The trade network theory explains the what but not the why or the how. Here's the fundamental problem with the Viking DNA findings. The AI identified patterns in the data that are statistically significant and reproducible. Multiple independent analyses confirmed the anomalies. The data is solid. What we don't have is an explanation that accounts for all the findings. Human geneticists are trained to find explanations that fit existing models. When data contradicts the model, they look for errors in the data. When the data is confirmed as accurate, they modify the model minimally to accommodate the new findings. But the Viking DNA data doesn't allow minimal modifications. It requires rethinking fundamental assumptions about European population history. The AI doesn't care about existing models. It just identifies patterns. The fact that these patterns don't make sense according to our current understanding isn't the AI's problem. It's our problem. But here's what makes this genuinely revolutionary. Every time AI systems have been used to analyze data previously analyzed by humans, they've found things humans missed. Not because the AI is smarter, but because it doesn't have preconceptions about what should be there. The Viking DNA analysis is following this pattern. Human geneticists analyzed these same remains years ago and concluded that Viking genetics matched expectations. Vikings were Scandinavians with some mixing from trade and raids. End of story. The AI looked at the exact same data without expectations and said no. Something much stranger is happening here. If the AI's findings hold up under continued scrutiny, and right now there's no reason to think they won't, it means our understanding of European population history is incomplete at best and wrong at worst. It means there were populations in Europe during the Viking Age with genetic lineages we can't trace. Either these lineages survived from pre-Ice Age populations in ways we don't understand, or they came from populations we haven't identified yet, or there's something fundamentally wrong with how we analyze and interpret ancient DNA. It means Vikings weren't who we thought they were genetically. They weren't just Scandinavians with some foreign admixture. They were one of the most genetically diverse populations in human history. And that diversity appeared suddenly and disappeared just as suddenly. It means the neat story of human migration into Europe, mixing patterns, and population continuity is messier than we thought. There are gaps in our knowledge big enough to hide entire populations. The AI didn't solve these mysteries. It revealed them. The uncomfortable part is that revealing mysteries is supposed to lead to answers. Right now, 2 years after the initial findings, geneticists still don't have answers. They have more data, more analysis, and more confirmation that the anomalies are real. What they don't have is an explanation that makes sense. The Viking DNA data is forcing a choice. Either our models of human population genetics are incomplete and need major revision, or we're missing historical context about Viking-era interactions that would explain the genetic mixing, or there's a third option nobody has thought of yet. The AI revealed the problem. Humans still have to solve it. And right now, we're not even close.